History is often written in the broad, masculine strokes of generals, dictators, and soldiers. We remember the names of the men who set the world on fire, the architects of the final solution who sat behind oak desks. But in the long shadows of the barbed wire, amidst the smell of scorched earth and the silence of the mass graves, stood others. They wore the crisp uniforms of the SS or the elegant silks of the Nazi high society. They were wives, mothers, and daughters, and they were monsters. In the dark documentary of the Third Reich, the feminine was not synonymous with mercy. It was often the face of a more intimate, more calculated cruelty. These were the women who watched the smoke rise from the chimneys with indifference, who turned human skin into lampshades, and who poisoned their own children to prove their loyalty to a dying cult. They were the Aufseherinnen, the female guards, and the elite socialites who fueled the engine of genocide. Tonight, we peel back the veil of the weaker sex to reveal the iron hearts beneath. We explore the lives and the well-deserved ends of 15 women who surrendered their humanity to the Reich. From the blood-stained mud of the concentration camps to the claustrophobic darkness of the Führer bunker, this is the story of the women who didn't just follow orders, they enjoyed them. 1. Irma Grese, the hyena of Auschwitz. At just 22 years old, Irma Grese became the personification of the Reich's corrupted youth. She was a woman who traded her soul for a whip and a pair of heavy boots. As a senior supervisor at Auschwitz-Birkenau and later Bergen-Belsen, Grese wasn't a bureaucrat, she was a predator. She was known for her curated appearance, perfect hair and heavy perfume, which she used as a chilling contrast to the filth of the camps. Her cruelty was sadistic and intimate. She frequently set her half-starved dogs on prisoners, watched as they were torn apart, and personally selected thousands for the gas chambers with a casual flick of her hand. Survivors remembered her eyes, cold, blue, and utterly devoid of empathy. She didn't just follow the ideology. She reveled in the power it gave her over life and death. Her end was as defiant as her life was bloody. Captured by the British, Grese showed no remorse during the Belsen trial. She laughed in the face of the witnesses, but the laughter died in the cold morning of December 13, 1945. At the age of 22, she became the youngest woman executed under British law in the 20th century. As the hangman, Albert Pierpoint, adjusted the noose around her neck, she uttered a single sharp word: "Schnell," quickly. The trapdoor snapped open, and the hyena was silenced forever. But while Grese was a product of the camp's raw violence, the next woman on our list turned the suffering of prisoners into a grotesque form of art. 2. Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald. Ilse Koch was the shadow that haunted the woods of Buchenwald. As the wife of the camp commandant, Karl Otto Koch, she held no official rank, yet she exercised a terrifying authority born of pure depravity. Koch was infamous for her hobbies. She would ride her horse through the camp, whipping any prisoner who dared to look at her. But her true infamy lay in her collection of human trophies. She was accused of selecting prisoners with unique tattoos, ordering them killed, and then having their skin tanned to create lampshades, book bindings, and gloves. To her, the victims were not even cattle. They were raw materials for her household decor. She was a bureaucrat of the macabre, turning the camp into a personal fiefdom of horror. Justice for Koch was a long, agonizing process. After the war, she was sentenced to life imprisonment, but later had her sentence commuted, sparking international outrage. However, the ghosts of Buchenwald would not let her go. Rearrested and sentenced again by West German authorities, she spent her final years in Eichach prison. On September 1st, 1967, the witch finally ran out of victims. She tied her bedsheets into a noose and hanged herself in her cell. She left a note claiming she was a victim of circumstance, a lie that followed her into the grave. But while Koch sought trophies of skin, our next figure sought a more refined musical form of psychological torture. 3. Maria Mandl, the Beast of Auschwitz. Maria Mandl was the high priestess of the female camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. A woman of high intelligence and absolute coldness, she was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 500,000 women and children. Mandl was the architect of the Women's Orchestra. She forced talented prisoners to play upbeat marches and classical music while their fellow inmates were marched to the gas chambers or collapsed from exhaustion. This was her symphony of screams, a psychological weapon designed to shatter the spirit before the body was destroyed. She took a perverse pleasure in adopting Jewish children, showering them with gifts, only to personally escort them to the ovens when she grew bored of the game. Her fall came in the ruins of the post-war world. Arrested in her native Austria, she was handed over to Poland to face the survivors of her orchestra. During the Auschwitz trial in Krakow, the beast sat in the dock, her face a mask of indifference. She was sentenced to death by hanging. On January 24, 1948, as she stood on the gallows in Montelupich prison, there were no violins playing for her. Her death was slow and clinical. She was a woman who believed she was untouchable because of her rank, much like the next woman on our list, who believed she was the mother of a new civilization, until that dream turned into a nightmare in a Berlin bunker. 4. Magda Goebbels, the First Lady of Death. Magda Goebbels was the model mother of the Third Reich, a woman whose image was used to define Nazi womanhood. But beneath the elegant dresses and the propaganda lay a fanaticism that defied human instinct. As the wife of Joseph Goebbels, she occupied the highest circles of power. As the Red Army closed in on Berlin in April 1945, Magda made a decision that remains one of the darkest chapters of the war. She moved her 6 children into the Führer bunker. She believed that a world without National Socialism was not worth living in, and she would not allow her children to grow up in a world where her ideology had failed. On the night of May 1, 1945, Magda Goebbels became the executioner of her own blood. With the help of an SS doctor, she drugged her children with morphine and then crushed cyanide capsules in their mouths as they slept. Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holda, Hedda, and Haida, ages 4 to 12, were murdered by the woman who had brought them into the world. Shortly after, Magda and Joseph walked out into the bunker garden and committed suicide. Her body was partially burned, a charred ruin of the woman who chose genocide over a future. Her fanaticism was ideological, but our next subject found her calling in the physical brutality of the Black Forest of Ravensbrück. 5. Dorothea Binz, the Master of Ravensbrück. Dorothea Binz was not a wife or a socialite. She was a career officer of misery. At the Ravensbrück concentration camp, she rose to the position of Oberaufseherin, where she trained younger women in the art of brutality. Binz was known for her cold-blood approach to violence. She would often kick female prisoners to death during roll call or use her whip until the victims were unrecognizable. She took pleasure in selecting women for medical experiments or the gas chambers, often watching the executions with a look of detached curiosity. To Binz, The camp was a laboratory where she could test the limits of human endurance and her own capacity for hatred. When the Reich collapsed, Binz attempted to vanish into the chaos of a broken Germany. She fled during a death march, but was captured by British forces shortly after. During her trial, she remained stoic, her face showing the same icy indifference she had displayed at Ravensbrück. She was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death. On May 2, 1947, she was led to the gallows. Even as the hood was placed over her head, she refused to ask for forgiveness. Binz was a foot soldier of the Holocaust, but she paved the way for those who committed crimes not with whips, but with scalpels and chemicals. 6. Herta Oberhäuser, the Angel of the Scalpel. In the sterile, cold rooms of Ravensbrück, Herta Oberhäuser turned the Hippocratic Oath into a death warrant. She was not a guard, but a physician, a woman who used her medical degree to become an architect of agony. Oberhäuser specialized in sulfonamide experiments, where she intentionally inflicted horrific wounds on female prisoners known as rabbits. She would cut into their legs, rub bacteria, glass, and rusty nails into the open flesh to simulate battlefield injuries, and then watch as gangrene consumed their bodies. To Oberhäuser, these women were not patients. They were disposable tissue. When the experiments were over, she often murdered the survivors with lethal injections of gasoline or Evapan, calmly recording the time of death as if she were merely clocking out of a shift. Her ending was a chilling example of justice delayed. Sentenced to 20 years during the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, she was released after serving only 5 for good behavior. In an ultimate insult to her victims, she returned to practicing medicine in West Germany, becoming a family pediatrician. It took the tireless efforts of survivors to finally have her medical license revoked in 1958. She died in 1978 in relative obscurity, a quiet end for a woman who had orchestrated such loud, agonizing pain. While Oberhäuser used the scalpel, our next subject used her heavy, iron-shod boots to leave a permanent mark on history.
7. Hermine Braunsteiner, the Stomping Mare. Hermine Braunsteiner earned her moniker, the Stomping Mare, through a specific, brutal signature of violence. At the Majdanek concentration camp, she was known for her towering height and her habit of kicking prisoners, especially the elderly and children, until they died. She would grab young children by the hair and throw them onto trucks destined for the gas chambers, then turn her boots on the mothers who tried to intervene. Braunsteiner represented the terrifying normalcy of evil. After the war, she managed to vanish into the tapestry of the ordinary world. She married an American soldier and moved to Queens, New York, where she lived for years as a quiet, polite housewife who baked cakes for her neighbors. The mask slipped in 1964 when the Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal tracked her down. The image of the Queen's housewife was shattered as she became the first Nazi criminal to be extradited from the United States. During her trial in West Germany, the world watched as the elderly woman in the dock was revealed to be a monster of the camps. She was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1981. Her end was physically symbolic of her crimes. Due to severe diabetes, both of her legs, the very tools of her cruelty, were amputated before she died in a prison hospital in 1999. But while Braunsteiner used her own strength to kill, our next figure relied on the primal fury of beasts. 8. Wanne Bormann, the woman with the dogs. Wanne Bormann was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she cast a long, dark shadow over Lichtenberg, Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz. Known as Wiesel, the Weasel, or simply the woman with the dogs, she was never seen without her large, ferocious German shepherd. Bormann lacked the Aryan beauty of Greza, or the social status of cock. She was a blunt instrument of terror. She took sadistic pleasure in using her dog as a weapon, ordering it to attack defenseless prisoners for the slightest infraction. She would watch with a grim, thin-lipped smile as the animal tore into the flesh of women who were already skeletal from starvation. To Bormann, the dog was the superior creature, and the prisoners were less than the dirt beneath its paws. Her end was swift and clinical, a direct consequence of the British liberation of Bergen-Belsen. Captured amidst the mounds of unburied corpses, Bormann tried to claim she was merely a victim of the system. The court did not agree. At the Belsen trial, she was convicted for her wanton cruelty. On December 13, 1945, she walked to the same gallows as Irma Grese. At 52 years old, she was the oldest woman to be hanged that day. She died without a word of regret, a bitter woman who chose to spend her life as a master of hounds in a hell of her own making. Yet, while Bormann was a predator in the field, our next subject was the cold gatekeeper of the gas chambers. 9. Greta Bösel, the specialist of selection. Greta Bösel was a trained nurse, but at Ravensbrück, she practiced a very different kind of care. She was a labor overseer, and her primary duty was selection. In the twisted logic of the Reich, human life was measured only by its capacity for work. Bösel was the one who decided when that capacity had been exhausted. With a cold, calculating gaze, she would walk the lines of women, identifying those who were too weak, too sick, or too old to continue. Her infamous mantra was, "If they cannot work, let them rot." She didn't just send people to the gas chambers, she optimized the process, ensuring that the camp functioned like a well-oiled machine of death. Bösel's defense after the war was the quintessential Nazi excuse. She claimed she was terrified of her superiors and only followed orders. But witnesses described a woman who acted with independent malice, often beating prisoners she deemed lazy before marking them for death. The British military court found her excuses hollow. On May 3, 1947, she was executed by hanging at Hamelin prison. She died alongside Dorothea Bintz, two professionals of the Holocaust who had forgotten that the world still held a place for accountability. Her cold efficiency was matched only by our next figure, who rose to power by modeling herself after the most feared women in the SS.
10. Elisabeth Volkenrath, the disciple of the beast. Elisabeth Volkenrath was the protégée of Maria Mandel, and she learned her lessons well. Starting as a simple guard, she rose through the ranks of the SS Aufseherinnen to become the Oberaufseherin at Bergen-Belsen. Volkenrath was a technician of discipline. She was responsible for the grueling roll calls that lasted for hours in the freezing mud, where prisoners were forbidden to move or speak. Those who collapsed were often beaten or sent to the gas chambers under her direct supervision. She was described as having a mechanical cruelty, never screaming, never losing her temper, but consistently and dispassionately inflicting suffering. She was the dark mirror of the Nazi ideal, organized, obedient, and utterly heartless. When Bergen-Belsen was liberated, the British found Volkenrath still at her post, surrounded by the skeletal survivors and thousands of unburied dead. She was arrested and tried alongside Irma Grese. Throughout the trial, she maintained a look of bored arrogance, as if the proceedings were beneath her. But the arrogance vanished when the sentence of death was read. On December 13, 1945, she joined the grim procession to the gallows at Hamelin. Volkenrath's death marked the end of a career built on the meticulous destruction of others. But as we move from the guards to the wives of the leaders, we encounter a woman who didn't use a whip, but a charm that hid a terrifying beauty. Our next figure was known as the beautiful spectre of Stutthof. She believed her youth and appearance would save her from the hangman's noose, turning her trial into a macabre fashion show. 11. Jenny Vonda Barkman, the beautiful spectre. Jenny Vonda Barkman was a woman who used her beauty as a mask for a terrifying, predatory nature. At the Stutthof concentration camp, she was known as the beautiful spectre, a nickname that captured both her striking appearance and her ghostly lack of soul. Barkman was notorious for her brutal treatment of prisoners, often selecting women and children for the gas chambers with a chillingly casual air, as if she were choosing fruit at a market. She took a perverse pride in her appearance, ensuring her hair and makeup were perfect, even as she stood amidst the filth and despair of the camp. To Barkman, the suffering of inferiors was merely a backdrop for her own vanity. Her end was a macabre spectacle that captivated the post-war world. During the Stutthof trial in Gdansk, she sat in the dock wearing fashionable clothes and flirting with her guards. She seemed to believe that her beauty would grant her immunity from the hangman's noose. When the death sentence was read, she reportedly remarked, "Life is indeed a pleasure, and pleasures are usually short." On July 4, 1946, she was executed by public hanging on Biskupia Gorka Hill. Thousands gathered to watch as the beautiful spectre was dropped from the back of a truck. She died as she had lived, obsessed with the image she projected, even as the life was choked out of her. While Barkman sought the spotlight, our next subject was a woman who rose to power in the desperate final months of the war. 12. Ruth Neudeck, the late-hour executioner. Ruth Neudeck was a latecomer to the SS, but she made up for lost time with a ferocity that shocked even her colleagues. Joining the staff at Ravensbrück in 1944, she quickly rose to the rank of Oberaufseherin of the Uckermark subcamp. Neudeck was a specialist of the end times. As the Reich crumbled, she oversaw the systematic extermination of thousands of women and children. She was known for her efficiency in the gas chambers, often personally supervising the gassing of over 3,000 victims in a single month. Survivors described her as a woman who seemed to draw energy from the chaos of the collapsing camp, turning the final days of Ravensbrück into a concentrated hell of blood and screams. Justice found Neudeck in the ruins of a defeated Germany. Captured by British forces, she was tried at the Third Ravensbrück trial. Unlike many who pleaded ignorance, the evidence of Neudeck's hands-on involvement in mass murder was overwhelming. She was sentenced to death and executed on July 29, 1948, at Hamelin prison. Her death was a clinical end to a career of frantic, late-hour slaughter. But while Neudeck was a foot soldier of the camps, our next figure was the mother of the final solution, the woman who stood behind the man who planned the Holocaust. 13. Lena Heydrich, the unrepentant widow. Lena Heydrich was the woman who built a monster. As the wife of Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, she wasn't just a bystander, she was his ideological engine. Lena was a fanatical Nazi long before her husband, and she pushed the ambitious naval officer toward the high circles of the SS. She lived in a palace in occupied Prague, surrounding herself with the spoils of genocide, while her husband earned the title, the Butcher of Prague. To Lena, the millions who died were a necessary sacrifice for the new world she and Reinhard were creating. She viewed the suffering of others as a minor inconvenience in the grand tapestry of Nazi glory. Unlike the guards who faced the gallows, Lena Heydrich survived the war and lived a long, comfortable life. She remained utterly unrepentant until the day she died. In her memoirs, she defended her husband's actions and portrayed herself as a victim of post-war persecution. She lived on the island of Fehmarn, running a guest house and hosting former SS officers, keeping the dark flame of her ideology alive in secret. She died in 1985, a bureaucrat of memory who successfully evaded the hangman but remained imprisoned by her own hatred. Her defiant survival stood in stark contrast to the next woman who lived as the theatrical queen of the Reich. 14. Emmy Goering, the Queen of High Society. Emmy Goering was the First Lady of the Reich in the years before Magda Goebbels claimed the title. A former actress, she treated the Nazi regime as her grandest stage. As the wife of Hermann Goering, she lived in a world of staggering luxury. Karenhall, their massive estate, was filled with stolen art, priceless jewels, and the finest wines, all purchased with the blood of Europe. Emmy was the public face of Nazi glamour, hosting lavish banquets while millions starved in the ghettos. She claimed to be apolitical, a simple artist who knew nothing of the camps, yet she basked in the power and status that only the proximity to genocide could provide. Her downfall was a slow descent from the throne to the gutter. After the war, she was arrested and spent several years in labor camps and prisons during the denazification process. The jewels were gone, the palaces were ruins, and her husband had cheated the gallows with a cyanide pill. Emmy spent her final years in a small apartment in Munich, a forgotten relic of a regime that had burned itself out. She died in 1973, still maintaining the facade of a misunderstood star. She was the woman who looked away from the smoke, but our final figure was the one who followed the monster into the very heart of the fire.
15. Eva Braun, the shadow in the bunker. Eva Braun was the ultimate enigma of the Third Reich, the woman who lived in the shadow of the man who sought to dominate the world. For 12 years, she was Hitler's secret companion, hidden away at the Berghof, living a life of domestic mundanity amidst the planning of a world war. Braun was not a guard or a policymaker, but her loyalty was absolute. She spent her days taking home movies, swimming, and waiting for the Führer to return from his headquarters. She was the banality of evil personified in a floral dress, a woman who saw the maps of conquered nations on the table and chose to focus on the color of the curtains. Her end was the only moment she stepped into the light. In April 1945, as the Soviet shells pounded the ground above the Führer bunker, Eva finally received what she had wanted for over a decade: a marriage certificate. Their wedding was a macabre ceremony in a concrete tomb, celebrated with champagne and the smell of death. Less than 40 hours later, Eva Braun sat on a sofa next to Hitler and bit into a cyanide capsule. She died in an instant, a silent partner to the greatest criminal in history. Her body was carried into the garden and burned, a final, blackened sacrifice to a cult of death that had finally consumed itself. These 15 women remind us that the capacity for monstrous acts is not bound by gender. They were doctors, wives, guards, and mothers. They lived in luxury, they commanded with whips, and they watched the world burn with indifference. Their ends, whether on the gallows, by their own hand, or in quiet obscurity, serve as a final testament to a regime that turned human beings into tools of destruction. The shadows they cast still linger over the sites of their crimes, a silent warning that evil does not always wear a soldier's uniform. Sometimes it wears a smile.